All right, and so in the last video I showed how to set up a very simple MySQL server and a clone to replicate itself to. In this video, we're going to skip all of that process, but we're going to cover a few extra steps that you would have to do if you already had data on the master server before you start to clone it. So the problem is that the first of all, the master server doesn't record a bin file unless you tell it that it's going to be a master server and you uncomment those couple lines in there for the server ID. So that's your first problem, is there wouldn't be a bin file for the client to even replicate from. The other problem is that over time, even if you had the master server set up like that, it doesn't store the bin files for eternity. And so it's only going to have a certain period of time to even replicate from. And so depending on how old the server is and how much data is on the server, there's a high likelihood that we're going to have to actually export all of the databases off of the master server, copy them over to the client server, the replication server, and then restore them there before we turn on the actual slave process. And so we're going to kind of go through how to do all of that stuff now. So the first thing that we want to do is we're going to start off on the master server. And so what we want to do is we're going to log into MySQL real quick, because there's one thing that we need to do first. And the reason that we need to do this, so we're on the master server and we're going to say show master status. And what this is going to do is it's going to give us a bin file, in this case mysql-bin.506, and then a position in that bin file that it is currently at on the master server. So think about the bin log file is what it's writing all of these transactions to, and the position is where in that bin log file it is at this particular point. Now, I don't really care about looking at this yet, because there's one thing that we need to do on the server before we actually get this information. And the reason is because it's possible that the server is still being written to. And so me grabbing this data and then turning around and doing an export, it may not be correct by the time I do the export. So what we've got to do first is we need to lock the database server so that no one can write into this database until we export all of the databases into our file. And so what we're going to do to make that happen is we're going to type flush tables with read write, or I'm sorry, read lock. And so as soon as I hit this command, that database server is going to become locked down. No one can write to that server while I'm doing this. And so we're going to start that process. Then we're going to get our bin information. So then I'm going to say show master status. And now I'm going to write this information down on a piece of paper because I need to make sure that I keep this data. All right, and so what we're going to do now is we're going to jump out here. Now I'm currently in a home folder, but you can be anywhere that you want to actually do this. But what we're going to do is we're going to type MySQL dump, and then we are going to, I'm trying to log in, root -p, and then we are going to tell it that we want to update all or export all databases, and then we're also going to go ahead and export our master data. And this data actually contains the bin log information from above, but we're just going to record it and do that anyway. And then we're going to tell it to export this to all databases.sql. And so what this is doing is it's going to take every single database on the master server and it's going to stick all of it into a text file called all databases.sql. And so I'm not going to run that right now because I don't want to sit and wait on it. But what that will end up doing is it will actually create a file that is sitting here, and you can see it here, all databases.sql. And so now what I'm going to do is I am going to use scopy all databases dot SQL or SQL, and we're going to copy it over to the other database. So we're just going to go in here and put in the IP address. We're going to tell it to put it in home G Hancock. And so what that's going to do is it's going to copy this file over to my home directory on the other server. Now, before I leave this server, I want to go ahead and go back into my SQL. And we want to release those locks. So we're just going to say unlock tables. And so what that's going to do is it's going to reactivate the master server so that it can start working again. So the period of time that I have to have it down is while I'm exporting the data. And again, it's because that text file that I'm copying over to the server or to the clone, I need to make sure that it is currently at location, in our case 88058, and not some other location due to the fact that somebody wrote another record in while I was trying to export the data. And so that's just the way you have to do the server. So we're done with the server. It is all 100% ready to be replicated. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to go over here to the clone server. And what we need to do here, and again, we need to do this before we started that clone, the slave. So or if you watch the other video, what we ended up doing in the end of the video is we type start slave. Well, before we actually import this data, we need to make sure that the slave is not currently running trying to process data. So what we're going to do real quick just to make sure is we're going to come into the server and we're going to type stop slave. And so that's going to tell the slave to stop replicating data from the server. So it disconnects from the master server so we don't have any craziness going on while we're trying to restore this database. And so we're going to quit out of there. We're going to go into my home folder. And so now what we want to do is we want to restore that data. So we're going to type in MySQL minus user root minus P. And then what we are going to do is we're going to tell it to pull in all databases.sql. And so what we're doing here is we're going to take all of that database information that was in the MySQL folder or inside of that all databases.sql, and we are going to pull it into the clone server so that it can then begin to replicate the data. And again, I'm not going to run that because I've got to make sure that everything is good. Now, inside of that all databases.sql file, it actually has the log information for where we were in the log file and what position we were. If we do a tail, I'm not sure exactly. We'll try this tail. It wasn't enough. Actually, we might be able to just open this. And so when we open this file up, you'll notice up here at the top of the file, it says change master to master log file, and it gives you the log file and the number. So technically we didn't have to write that information down from the server. I just like to write it down to make sure that I have it. But if you're doing the all data, it includes that in this log file so that you don't have to do anything else to get this thing restored and ready to start replicating. So what we're going to do then is we're going to go through our MySQL. We're going to redirect the information from all data into, or all tables into, the database server. Then we are going to log into the database server. If you remember from earlier, I told you that there were some other files that you would, or other things that you could add into the change master to master host information. Because it's included in the file that we just brought in, we don't have to go back and do that. If we didn't have it in the file, then we would manually go in and add that information to the database so that it knows which log file to start looking at and where in the replication process we are. And so all we've got to do now is we just come over here and tell it to start slave. And the information from the first video where we set up the user and told it what server it's going to be slaving, all of that stuff is still here. And so all we're going to do is type start slave, and it is going to take the log file and the location in that log file. It's going to jump down to it on the master server and make sure that it is currently at that location, and anything it's missing, because remember, somebody may have been inserting records into the master server while we were restoring these databases. Anything that got done while in the middle, it's going to go grab all of that information and pull it into the clone server. And so at that point, all of the data from the old server is in the new server, and they're replicating just as if they had been set up that way all along.